August 1812. A man is walking through the Jordanian desert. He wears a flowing Arabic dishdasha and a turban. His beard is dark, his skin burned brown from months of sun. His name is Johann Ludwig Burckhardt, and he is Swiss, born in Basel, educated in London, bankrolled by the British African Association, an organization that pays young Europeans to cross unmapped parts of Africa. His actual mission: reach the legendary city of Timbuktu, deep in the Sahara. He hasn't gotten there yet. He's been wandering the Middle East for 3 years, learning Arabic, learning to pass as someone he isn't. Right now, Burckhardt is lying to the man beside him. His guide, a local Bedouin, thinks he is traveling with a Muslim pilgrim named Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah. Burckhardt has told the guide he wants to sacrifice a goat at the mountain shrine of the prophet Aaron, somewhere near these cliffs. A reasonable request for a devout traveler. The guide has agreed to take him, but the guide doesn't entirely trust him. He watches too closely, asks too many questions. Burckhardt is trembling, and not from the cold. If this man discovers who he really is, a European, a Christian, snooping through lands that don't welcome strangers, the outcome is simple. He won't leave alive. In his pack, a goatskin bag of water and a notebook. For the guide's services, Burckhardt paid with a pair of old horseshoes. That was the going rate. Why the risk? Because Burckhardt had heard something. In conversations with local tribespeople, someone had mentioned ruins, ancient ruins, hidden inside a narrow gorge between cliff walls. Enormous, carved buildings, they said. Nobody in Europe knew about them. The locals didn't seem to care very much, and outsiders didn't come here. Burckhardt decided he had to see them for himself. So here he is, following his suspicious guide across stone and dry scrub, his heart going faster than his feet. They reach a gap in the cliffs. It is maybe 5 meters wide. Burckhardt steps inside and begins to walk. The passage twists and turns like a river frozen in rock. Walls of red sandstone rise on both sides, 80 feet high, sometimes higher. The sky above is a thin strip of blue. Almost no sunlight reaches the ground. The air is cooler in here, damp in places. Water has been cutting this gorge for millions of years, and you can see it in the smoothed curves of the stone, in the layers of color, red and pink and orange, bending in waves like the pages of a book left out in the rain. Burckhardt walks for about half an hour, and then, around the final bend, the canyon opens, and something appears. A building, a facade carved directly into the face of the cliff, so large that it fills the entire field of view. Corinthian columns, 4 of them across the lower level, 6 on the upper, with statues of mythological figures standing between them, winged and robed. And on top, at the very summit, a stone urn the size of a small room. The whole thing is the height of a 13-story building, 28 meters wide, 40 meters tall. That is roughly twice the height of the carved presidential faces on Mount Rushmore. And all of it, the columns and the statues and the scrollwork, was cut from one piece of rock. Not assembled from blocks, the way the Egyptians built the pyramids. Carved, like a sculptor working on a single piece of marble, only the marble is an entire cliff. Burckhardt barely has time to pull out his notebook and make a quick pencil sketch before his guide notices. The guide is getting nervous. What kind of pilgrim stops to draw pictures? Burckhardt scribbles a few lines in his journal and puts the notebook away. Later, safe in his tent, he writes the words that will eventually reach London and changed the way Europe thinks about the ancient world. He calls this place one of the most elegant remains of antiquity existing in Syria. He adds, its state of preservation resembles that of a building recently finished. He is the first European in 1,000 years to see this place. He is looking at Petra. The facade he sketched that afternoon is called Al-Hazneh, which means the Treasury. The local Bedouin had a different name for it. They called it Qasr al-Faraun, the Pharaoh's castle. They believed the stone urn at the very top held treasure, gold or jewels, something worth guarding for centuries. And for generations, Bedouin marksmen had fired their rifles at that urn, trying to crack it open. If you visit today, you can still see the bullet holes, dozens of them, pitting the surface. Inside the urn, nothing, solid stone. Most Americans, it turns out, know this facade without knowing its name. In 1989, Steven Spielberg used it as the entrance to the Holy Grail Temple in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The shot of Harrison Ford stepping out of the narrow canyon and seeing this building for the first time became one of the most famous frames in the history of cinema. Before the film, Petra received a few thousand visitors a year. After it, nearly 1 million. And in October of 2024, a joint Jordanian-American team made a discovery that even a screenwriter couldn't have invented. Beneath the Treasury, buried under centuries of sand and rubble, they found a previously unknown tomb. Inside, 12 skeletons and a ceramic vessel. Josh Gates, the American television host who covered the dig, held the vessel up to the camera and said it looked nearly identical to the Holy Grail from the movie. Life and art trading places, literally underfoot. But here's the part that should bother you. Stand in front of the Treasury, look at the facade, and search for a name, a date, a dedication, anything written at all. You won't find it. Next to the most spectacular building in Petra, the stone is bare. No inscription of any kind. The people who built this city, a people called the Nabataeans, left more than 800 carved tombs across these cliffs. Many of those tombs carry inscriptions, the names of the dead, curses against anyone who dares open the grave. But on the Treasury, their greatest monument, the Nabataeans carved nothing. We don't know who commissioned it or when. Was it a tomb? A temple? Nobody can say for certain. What we do know is this. When archaeologists dug down and found the original ground level 5 to 6 meters below today's surface, they uncovered the remains of a monumental staircase leading up from a public plaza to the facade's entrance. This building was meant to be seen, meant to be climbed to. And then, somehow, it was forgotten. The sand rose, the staircase vanished, and for 1,000 years, no one in the wider world knew it was here. We'll come back to the Treasury. Its secret, or at least what we think we know of it, will wait until the end. For now, a different question. Because the Treasury is only one building in a city of thousands, and the real mystery isn't what's behind the facade. The real mystery is the people who made it. The Nabataeans were, originally, nomads. They lived in tents and herded goats across the desert. They drank no wine, built no houses, planted no orchards. This, at least, is what the Greek writers said about them. And yet, in the space of a few centuries, these same nomads built a city of 30,000 people in one of the driest places on the planet. a city with a water supply carried through terracotta pipes for 5 miles, with a pool the size of an Olympic swimming pool, with fountains and gardens and a colonnaded main street. Greek diplomats mentioned this place in the same sentence as Alexandria. How did they do it? How do tent dwellers become the builders of a place like this? And there is another question, a quieter one, that runs beneath the first. We know almost nothing about the Nabataeans from their own hand. They were literate, they could write, and they left hundreds of short inscriptions scratched into canyon walls. But they never wrote a history of their own, never recorded their own story. Everything we think we know about them comes from outsiders, from Greeks and Romans who watched the Nabataeans with a mix of envy and confusion, and wrote down what they saw. The Nabataeans themselves stayed silent. Who were these people, and what were they keeping to themselves? So let's take that silence seriously, because it isn't a small thing. Across the Jordanian desert, on cliff faces and canyon walls, you find inscriptions in Nabataean Aramaic, a language closely related to the one spoken by Jesus of Nazareth a few centuries later. Traders carved markers for each other along the routes between oases. Shepherds scratched their own names into rock, the way teenagers today carve initials into park benches, just to say, "I was here." The Nabataeans could read and write. They had their own alphabet. And yet they produced no historical text of any kind, no chronicle, no record of their own kings or wars or treaties, nothing resembling what the Egyptians left behind, or the Greeks, or even much smaller and less wealthy kingdoms in the ancient world. Think about what that means. Imagine a modern country with schools and newspapers and a postal service, and then imagine opening the National Archives and finding them completely empty. No documents, no correspondence, no accounts of anything that ever happened. Only gravestones. Because that is, in fact, all the Nabataeans left us. Their entire surviving body of writing, every scrap we have in their own language, falls into one category: inscriptions on tombs. Epitaphs. They told us who they buried. They told us nothing else. So where does our knowledge come from? It comes from other people. Foreigners who visited Nabataean lands, or fought against them, or traded with them, and then went home and wrote about what they saw. And every one of these sources has problems. The oldest detailed account of the Nabataeans was written by a Greek named Hieronymus of Chaldea, around 312 BC. Hieronymus was a diplomat and military officer. He had first-hand contact with the Nabataeans, and he wrote about them at length. There is one difficulty. His original text is gone, lost or destroyed centuries ago. What we actually read today is a retelling by another Greek writer named Diodorus Siculus, who lived about 300 years after Hieronymus. Diodorus copied parts of the older text into his own enormous history of the world, and that is our earliest source. Consider what this means. Our primary window into the Nabataeans of the 4th century BC is a copy made by someone who never met them, writing 3 centuries after the events he describes. Imagine if the main source on the Battle of Agincourt were a summary written by a Japanese historian in the 1700s. You'd read it, you might learn something, but you'd read it with one eyebrow raised. And Diodorus paints a very particular picture. His Nabataeans are fierce desert nomads, pure and unbending. He writes that they sow no grain, plant no fruit-bearing trees, drink no wine, and build no houses. Anyone who breaks these rules, he says, is punished with death. Because the Nabataeans believe that whoever owns such things can be forced to obey the powerful. Owning nothing, they answer to no one. It's a striking portrait, almost romantic. The noble savage of the ancient world, free because he owns nothing. But is it true? That's the question that has bothered scholars for 2,000 years. Because 3 centuries after Diodorus describes a people who refuse to build houses, the Nabataeans are living in one of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, with bathhouses and pools and colonnaded streets and wine cellars. So what happened? Either Diodorus, or Hieronymus before him, was painting a picture that was already out of date, a kind of nostalgic fairy tale about the pure nomad. Or the Nabataeans really did transform themselves from tent dwellers into city builders in an astonishingly short time. Scholars still argue about which is closer to the truth. The honest answer is, we don't know. We are reading a copy of a lost book about a people who didn't write their own story. The tomb inscriptions don't solve the mystery, but they open a window onto something else. The most complete ones come from a place called Hegra, the modern Madain Salih, in what is now Saudi Arabia. Hegra was the Nabataean kingdom's second capital, a southern outpost along the trade routes, and its tombs are carved into cliff faces the same way Petra's are. On many of them, the stone carries long inscriptions in Nabataean Aramaic, and they follow a pattern. Here is a typical one. This is the tomb and the platform and the enclosure which Hashabu, son of Naphiu, made for himself and his children, and Habu, his mother, and Rufu and Aftiu, his sisters. So far, a family record. But then the inscription continues. May Dushara curse anyone who buries herein any person other than those named above, or who sells, or buys, or pledges this tomb. Dushara was the chief Nabataean god, and the curse has teeth. The penalty for violating the tomb is 1,000 sela paid to Dushara, and the same amount again to the king, Aretas. From dozens of inscriptions like this one, we can piece together fragments of Nabataean life. We learn the names of their gods, and that families mattered enough to be carved in stone for eternity. We find the professions people held: diviner, exorcist, physician, centurion. We even find the names of the stonemasons who cut the tombs. Real people doing real work, recorded because someone wanted their grave to last forever. But about the city they built, about the decisions they made, the wars they fought, the routes they traveled, these inscriptions say nothing. They are postcards from the afterlife, and the afterlife doesn't discuss politics. There is one more outside observer worth hearing from, and he gives us something no one else does. Details about how the Nabataeans actually lived day to day. His name was Strabo, a Roman geographer writing in the 1st century AD, and his description of Nabataean customs reads almost like a traveler's diary. The Nabataeans, Strabo says, wore colored clothes, belted at the waist, and sandals on their feet, but no tunics underneath. The king dressed in purple, as kings in many cultures did, but he had a curious habit. He served himself at the table, without attendants or cupbearers. In fact, Strabo is struck by this. He writes that the Nabataeans serve one another, and this custom extends even to the kings. Slaves, he says, were almost non-existent. At feasts, 2 girl singers performed for the guests, and the king drank from golden goblets, a different one each time, 11 cups and no more. It's an odd detail, the 11 cups. Why 11? Strabo doesn't explain. And this is the trouble with his account. It is vivid, it is specific, but it is the report of a Roman looking at people he considers, at best, exotic outsiders. He watches them the way a Victorian traveler might watch a tribal ceremony, fascinated but detached, never quite sure whether what he is seeing is admirable or simply strange. We can learn a great deal from Strabo, but we are learning what a Roman noticed, not what a Nabataean would have chosen to tell us. And so we're left with riddles. Here are 3, and none of them has a firm answer. The first, why didn't the Nabataeans write their own history? One theory, they had oral keeper historians, specialists whose entire purpose was to memorize the tribe's past and pass it on through speech. In such a culture, writing a history down would be an act of betrayal. It would make the keeper unnecessary. If this is true, then the Nabataean silence isn't ignorance. It's a choice. A way of protecting a tradition so old and so valued that putting it on paper would have destroyed it. But this remains a guess. We have no direct proof. The second, who is buried in the Treasury? Remember, the facade has no inscription, so scholars can only compare its architectural style to other dated buildings and try to narrow the range. The candidates are 3 Nabataean kings, Aretas II, who ruled in the 2nd century BC, Obodas III, who ruled around the turn of the era, and Aretas IV, who ruled from 9 BC to 40 AD. Aretas IV is the current favorite among archaeologists because the treasury's style matches the period of greatest Nabataean wealth. His title, found on coins, was Lover of His People, but no inscription, no direct evidence connects him to the building. The mystery stands open. And the third riddle is perhaps the strangest. Over the centuries, the Nabataean script changed. Letters that were once angular grew curved, characters merged. The writing became more flowing, more connected. And if you lay out the stages of this change in order, from the earliest Nabataean inscriptions to the latest, you can watch one alphabet slowly becoming another. The Nabataean script turned into Arabic. The letters used today by 400 million people, the script of the Quran and of modern newspapers from Cairo to Jakarta, was born on these desert cliffs. The Nabataeans created one of the most widely used writing systems in human history. They had no idea they were doing it. To understand how a people who chose silence over writing somehow gave the world an alphabet, we need to understand what actually made the Nabataeans powerful. And that story begins with something much older than trade or ambition. It begins with water. Imagine you're a caravan driver. You've been walking for 3 days through open desert. Your lips are cracked. Your camel is wheezing. The water ran out yesterday. And then, without warning, the ground slopes downward, and you descend into a narrow valley between high cliffs. The air changes. It's cooler. And you hear a sound that stops you where you stand. Water trickling out of rock. A spring bubbling up from somewhere inside the cliff, collecting in a shallow pool at its base. Locals call it Ain Musa, the spring of Moses. The legend says this is the very spot where Moses struck the rock with his staff and water burst from stone. Whether or not you believe the story, the spring is real, and it has been flowing here for thousands of years. For a traveler coming out of the desert, finding it must have felt like a miracle, regardless of who was responsible. This spring is the reason Petra exists, and to understand why, you need to know something about the rock beneath your feet. The spot where Petra stands is a geological oddity. Beneath Jordan's surface lie two layers of sandstone, stacked one on top of the other like two blankets on a bed. The upper layer is the Disi Formation, younger and gray. The lower layer is the Ishrin Formation, and it is ancient, more than 500 million years old. Those swirling patterns in Petra's red stone, the bands of color that make tourists reach for their cameras, are the beds of rivers that flowed here during the Cambrian period, an era when this land had no trees, no animals, only mosses and lichens clinging to bare rock. The Arabian tectonic plate tilts to the northeast. Over millions of years, the upper gray layer erodes away, and the red sandstone underneath is left exposed. Here is where the water comes in. The red sandstone is porous, which means it absorbs rain the way a sponge absorbs water. Moisture seeps down through the rock, slowly, and when it meets a layer it can't pass through, it moves sideways and trickles out of the cliff face as a spring. Petra's cliffs, in other words, are giant natural water towers. They collect rain, store it inside their own stone, and release it at ground level. That is why people settled here, in the middle of one of the driest landscapes on Earth. The rock itself was giving them water. But a spring is a gift from nature. What the Nabataeans did with it was engineering. They carved aqueducts, that is, open channels for carrying water, directly into the cliff faces. They laid an underground pipeline of terracotta pipes running 5 miles from the Spring of Moses to the center of the city. Tens of thousands of individual pipe segments, each about 30 centimeters long, fitted end to end, every joint sealed with plaster. Every joint a place where something could go wrong. And here is where the story gets surprising. An American hydraulic engineer named Charles Ortloff wanted to understand how these pipes worked without bursting. He built a test tank about 8 meters long in a laboratory in California and ran water through a replica of the Nabataean system at different angles. At a 6-degree incline, the water ran fast, but it filled the pipe completely. The pressure inside the pipe built up and the joints cracked. Water leaked everywhere. Then Ortloff tried 4 degrees. At that angle, the water still flowed quickly, but a pocket of air stayed above the stream inside the pipe. That air gap meant the pressure never built high enough to burst the joints. The water moved, and the pipe held. When Ortloff went back to Petra and measured the actual incline of the Nabataean channels, the number was 4 degrees. Exactly 4. The Nabataeans had figured out a principle of open-channel hydraulics. That is, the physics of how water behaves inside a pipe that isn't completely full, roughly 2,000 years before engineers in the modern West wrote it down as a formula. They had no mathematics, no theory to guide them. But they had the answer. And the answer worked, pipe segment after pipe segment, for 5 miles through the desert. Still, there was a problem. The springs, even with all those pipes, could support a few thousand people at most. And the city, by the estimate of archaeologist Chris Tuttle, who spent 10 years doing fieldwork in Petra, held between 20 and 30,000. The springs alone couldn't explain that. So where was all the extra water coming from? To answer that, you need to picture a different kind of day in the desert, not the dry, baking heat you'd expect. A winter day. The sky goes dark without warning, thunder, and then a wall of brown water comes crashing down from the mountains, pouring through the canyons like a river that appeared from nowhere. This is a flash flood. In minutes, the torrent rips through narrow gorges, carrying stones and mud and anything else in its path. In 1963, one of these floods caught a group of 22 French tourists inside the canyon leading to the Treasury. All of them died. The Nabataeans knew these floods. They had been watching them for generations. And instead of running from the water, they decided to catch it. A Swiss architect named Ueli Belwald discovered 5 ancient dams in the canyon that leads to the Treasury. Each dam was cut into the rock on both sides of the gorge, forming a wall across the floor of the canyon. Alongside them, Belwald found a channel carved from solid stone, about 43 meters long and 5 meters deep, designed to divert floodwater sideways and slow the current before it could reach the city. The system was so well designed that when Belwald studied it, he said he couldn't improve on it. All he could do was restore it. Today, those rebuilt dams once again protect the Treasury from the same floods that have been tearing through this canyon since long before the Nabataeans arrived. And that was only part of the system. When you add it all up, Petra's water network included 8 springs, 36 dams, more than 100 cisterns and reservoirs, and 200 kilometers of pipelines. By Ortloff's calculations, the system delivered about 8 liters of water per person per day. In a world without showers or washing machines, that was more than enough for drinking, cooking, and keeping animals alive. But the Nabataeans didn't stop at enough. They went further, and the reason was military. Remember Diodorus Siculus, the Greek historian who described the Nabataeans as fierce nomads? He describes something that sounds almost like a spy novel. The Nabataeans, he writes, built secret underground reservoirs in the open desert, coated the inside walls with waterproof stucco, and left only tiny openings at the surface. These openings were camouflaged to sit flush with the surrounding ground. The markings that showed where to find them were readable only by Nabataeans themselves. An outsider could walk right over a hidden water supply and never know it was there. Think about what this means in a desert war. An invading army crosses into Nabataean territory. They bring water for a few days, maybe a week. The Nabataeans retreat, mount into the landscape, and wait. The enemy searches for wells, for springs, for any source of water. They find nothing. The hidden reservoirs are invisible. Day by day, the invaders grow weaker, and the Nabataeans, who know exactly where every drop is stored, move freely. They can outlast any army simply by waiting. Diodorus puts it plainly. He writes that the Nabataeans are exceptionally devoted to freedom. When a strong enemy approaches, they retreat into the desert, using it as a fortress, because the desert lacks water and is impossible to cross for others, but not for them. Water kept them alive. Water kept them free. But water alone doesn't make a civilization rich. What made the Nabataeans wealthy beyond anything their neighbors could imagine was trade. And the commodity at the center of that trade is something that sounds absurd to modern ears:
dried tree sap. The Treasury, that facade without a single inscription, is still keeping its secrets. Soon, we'll come closer to learning who may have built it. But first, we need to follow a smell that was worth more than gold.
If you're enjoying this story so far, a like and a subscription would mean a great deal. It helps more people discover this kind of content. And here's a question for you. The Nabataeans figured out the exact angle for their water pipes by trial and error, without any mathematical theory. What's the most impressive piece of ancient engineering you've ever heard of? Let me know in the comments. Imagine you're standing on a street in ancient Rome. The stench hits you before anything else. Open gutters running with waste, rotting meat from the butcher's stalls. Tanneries where workers soak animal hides in human urine. The smell of a Roman street on a summer afternoon was something you carried in your clothes for hours after you left it. And then you step inside the Temple of Jupiter. The doors close behind you, and the world changes. The air is sweet, warm. There are notes of lemon, of pine, of something woody and clean that you can't quite name. Thin ribbons of white smoke rise from bronze dishes toward the ceiling, curling through the columns. This is frankincense, and it does something that no other substance in the ancient world could do quite as well. It draws a line. On one side, the filthy, stinking, dangerous world of the living. On the other, the clean, sweet, calm world of the gods. Since the earliest civilizations, people linked bad smells with evil spirits and disease. If a room smelled foul, something was wrong with it. Something dangerous lived there. Frankincense reversed this feeling. When the smoke filled a temple, people felt that the gods were present. The smell pleased the nose, yes, but it did something deeper. It changed what the room meant. So what is frankincense exactly? It's a resin, a kind of natural glue, produced by trees of the Berseraceae family. These trees grow in only a few places on Earth: the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, parts of East Africa, and western India. When the bark is damaged, the tree responds the way your body responds to a cut. It sends resin to the wound. The resin seals the opening, hardens in the air, and kills bacteria that might infect the wood. Farmers figured out thousands of years ago that if you make careful cuts in the bark, the tree weeps resin on purpose. You wait a few weeks, then you come back and collect the hardened drops. Frankincense comes off as pale yellow tears. Myrrh, from a related tree, forms reddish-brown lumps. Herodotus, the Greek historian, writing in the 5th century BC, claimed that these trees were guarded by winged serpents, flying snakes that attacked anyone who came too close. This was almost certainly deliberate disinformation. Arabian farmers had every reason to keep competitors away from their trees. If people in Greece believed that the frankincense groves were defended by monsters, so much the better. The price stayed high. And the price was extraordinary. Frankincense appears in the book of Exodus as a required ingredient of the sacred incense mixture prepared for the Ark of the Covenant. In the Gospel of Matthew, the Magi bring gifts to the newborn Jesus: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Think about that list for a moment. Gold is obvious. Everyone understands what gold is worth. But frankincense and myrrh are placed alongside it as gifts fit for a king. That tells you something about how the ancient world valued these resins. The Roman Empire, at its peak, burned more than 1 million kilograms of frankincense every year. Thousands of temples, from the coast of Tunisia to the frontier forts of Scotland, needed a constant supply. And the only way to get frankincense from the places where it grew, in Yemen and Oman, to the places where it burned, all around the Mediterranean, was overland, through the desert. And the people who controlled that overland route, the people who decided what moved through and at what price, were the Nabataeans. They charged a tax of 25% on the value of all goods passing through their territory. Every camel load of frankincense and every sack of myrrh lost 1/4 of its worth to the Nabataean treasury before it reached the coast. Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer of the 1st century AD, looked at the numbers and came to a simple conclusion. He called the Nabataeans the wealthiest people on earth. To compare this to something modern, think of the oil trade in the 20th century. A single raw material that the entire developed world depends on, produced in a small number of countries, transported through a narrow corridor controlled by a handful of players. The Nabataeans sat at the bottleneck. Every merchant who wanted frankincense had to deal with them. And frankincense wasn't optional. Temples couldn't operate without it, and religious life across the empire depended on a steady supply. Refusing to buy frankincense would have been like a modern government refusing to buy fuel. But frankincense was only the beginning. Petra wasn't just a stop on one road. It sat at the crossing point of several, and the goods that passed through its market squares came from everywhere. Spices from the Far East, cinnamon, pepper, nutmeg, frankincense and myrrh from the south, ivory and sugar shipped across the Red Sea from Africa, tin from Afghanistan, lapis lazuli, a blue stone prized for jewelry and paint, obsidian from Abyssinia, cosmetics and perfumes packed inside giant seashells from the Red Sea coast, bitumen, a thick black tar from the Dead Sea, shipped to Egypt, where embalmers used it to preserve the dead. And from Petra, the roads fanned out, north to Damascus and Antioch, west through Gaza to the ports of Greece and Rome. Everything passed through. Everything left a tax behind. And that money built a city. Now, here's the part that puzzles people. How did a civilization of nomads, people who a few centuries earlier had been living in tents, learn to build in stone? The answer, it turns out, didn't come all at once. It came in stages, and you can still trace them if you know where to look. There is a flat-topped mountain in Petra called al-Biara. To reach the summit, you climb 1,000 steps carved into the rock. The sun is merciless up there, and the air feels like the inside of an oven. When you reach the top, you see a 360-degree panorama of empty desert with no buildings or walls in sight. Just stone and wind and silence. And yet, when researchers pointed LiDAR scanners at this plateau in the 2020s, the data showed what no human eye could see. 51 underground rainwater cisterns carved into the rock beneath the surface, with a combined capacity of 200,000 gallons. Enough water to support more than 1,000 people living up here permanently. al-Biara may be the place where the Nabataeans first stopped being nomads. Ancient Greek writers mention it as the settlement where this desert people first put down roots. Inside the caves on the plateau, you can see chisel marks where someone, very deliberately, widened natural openings into living spaces large enough for families. And above the entrances to these caves, there are small holes drilled into the rock, post holes where tent poles once stood. Think about that image. A cave with a tent pitched over its mouth. Half underground, half above. A home for people caught between two ways of living. One foot in the settled world, one foot still in the desert. Archaeologist Mohammed Najjar, who has worked at the site for years, puts it this way. There was a shift in their thinking. They began to bond with the land. From al-Biara, the Nabataeans moved to the next step. About 40 miles from Petra, they built Khirbet ed-Dari, a proper temple town. Already there was a central temple, a sacrificial altar, and stone reliefs carved in a style borrowed from Greek and Roman art. When fragments of the temple statues were taken to the Jordan Museum in Amman, researchers used three-dimensional scanning to virtually reassemble the pieces and fit them back onto the facade. For the first time in 2,000 years, you could see what the building had looked like when it was new. Each Nabataean settlement tells the same story. Tent, then cave, then carved stone, then a city that made Greek visitors stop and stare. A transformation that most civilizations in the ancient world needed thousands of years to complete. The Nabataeans did it in a few centuries. And when they finally built Petra, they didn't stop at houses and temples. They did something that, for a desert people, seems genuinely mad. They filled their city with water, pools, fountains, gardens, in a place where rain falls only a handful of days each year. How they managed it is where we're going next. Let's stay with one person for a moment. Her name is Leanne Badal, and in 1998, she is an archaeologist working out of Miami University of Ohio, a small school in the American Midwest that most people outside academia have never heard of. Badal has come to Petra to excavate a site that earlier survey teams had labeled the Market. It's a large open terrace beside the Great Temple, and the assumption was simple. A flat area near the main street, close to the temple, this must be where people bought and sold things. Vendor stalls, coins, broken pottery, the usual leftovers of ancient commerce. Badal starts digging. At first, the ground gives up exactly what she expects: sand, rubble, fragments of stone. And then, at about 2.5 meters down, her trowel hits something different. A layer of cement. Waterproof cement. She keeps digging. She finds a second wall, then a third. Then all 4 corners of an underground structure emerge from the earth. The dimensions are enormous, 43 meters by 24 meters. That is roughly the size of an Olympic swimming pool. In the center of the structure, there is a raised stone platform, like a small island. And around the edges, Badal finds irrigation channels leading down to a lower terrace, where soil analysis reveals traces of cultivation, roots, and organic matter. Something grew here. The market was never a market. It was a monumental pool with an island pavilion in the middle, surrounded by a garden. Date palms, most likely, based on the soil evidence. A place where people gathered, sat in the shade, looked out at the water. In a city where every drop had been carried through pipes and channels from miles away. Badal published her discovery in the American Journal of Archaeology. and it changed the way scholars thought about Petra. Before the pool, the standard picture was of a trading city, prosperous but practical, a place built for commerce and caravans. The pool didn't fit that picture. A pool this size, in the desert, had nothing to do with practical needs. It was a statement. It said, "We have so much water that we can waste it on beauty." And the pool was only one piece of a much larger display. Across Petra's city center, archaeologists have found decorative fountains along the colonnaded main street, water channels running in stone grooves beside the paving. Beneath the Great Temple itself, ground-penetrating radar, a technology that sends high-frequency waves into the earth and maps whatever the waves bounce off, revealed a hidden network of underground channels that nobody had known about. The water didn't arrive in Petra and stop. It was routed through the entire city, above ground and below, flowing past buildings and through open spaces the way streets carry people. Bedal herself found the best way to describe what Petra must have felt like to an outsider. She compared it to Las Vegas, an arid desert surrounding a city where water and fountains are everywhere you look. By channeling a precious resource into a center of wealth, she said, you send a message to everyone who sees it. This is where power lives. Think about what that meant for a caravan driver arriving from the south. You've spent days walking through open desert. Your skin is cracked. Your animals are half dead from thirst. And then you enter this narrow canyon. The cliffs close in, and you emerge into a city of carved facades with water running along the streets. Fountains catching the light, gardens, a pool you could swim across. For someone coming out of the desert, entering Petra must have felt like crossing from one world into another entirely. We have a picture of what that other world looked like, or at least what the Nabataeans wanted it to look like. In a small settlement near Petra known as Little Petra, archaeologists found a 1st century AD fresco painted on the ceiling of a dining room carved into the rock. The scene shows nothing of the desert. Instead, you see grapevines heavy with fruit, birds perching on branches, flowers in bloom, and a figure playing a flute. Radiocarbon dating confirms the painting is genuine. This is how the Nabataeans saw their own world, or how they wished others to see it. Green, alive, with music in the air. But a pool and some fountains, however impressive, still depend on water brought from springs and stored in cisterns. To feed 30,000 people and their animals, the Nabataeans needed something more. They needed farmland. And in a desert, there is no farmland. So they made some. This is where the story moves from engineering into something closer to what we'd now call terraforming. That is, reshaping the land itself to make it do what nature never intended. Imagine you're standing on a dig with archaeologists Sarah Newman and Felipe Rojas. In front of you, cutting across a dry riverbed, is a stone wall 3 meters high and 300 meters long, its base keyed into the bedrock underneath. This looks like it might be a foundation for a building, but there is no building above it, and when you look upstream, you see another wall like it, and another beyond that, spaced at intervals across the valley floor. These are not foundations, they are terraces. Here is how the system worked. In the wet season, rain fell on the hills above Petra. The water ran downhill, the way water always does, picking up loose soil and carrying it along. When this muddy stream hit a stone terrace, it slowed down. The soil, heavier than the water, dropped to the bottom and settled behind the wall. The water flowed over the top and continued to the next terrace, where the same thing happened again. Season after season, year after year, fertile earth accumulated between the stones. The Nabataeans were not farming soil that was already there. They were trapping soil that washed down from higher ground, building up their own fields, one rainstorm at a time. They made nature do the heavy work. As Felipe Rojas puts it, they figured out how to make nature work for them. And the scale of what they built is staggering. When researchers flew LiDAR scanners over the landscape around Petra, the data revealed terraces running along every watershed and seasonal stream bed, along every slope where water might collect and flow. Within an 8-mile radius of the city, surveyors have now mapped 32,000 acres of ancient earthworks, 70 cisterns, and 28 dams. The total capacity of Petra's combined water collection system comes to more than 10 million gallons of rainwater. That is enough for drinking, for cooking, for animals, and still enough left over to grow olives, wheat, fruit trees, and vineyards. The desert around Petra bloomed. And it bloomed because a people who had been herding goats across empty sand a few centuries earlier decided that the land could be forced to obey them. We started with a man in disguise who stumbled on a forgotten city. Since then, we've gone underground into secret reservoirs and followed the smoke of frankincense from a Roman temple back to the trees where it was harvested. We've watched terracotta pipes carry water at exactly the right angle across 5 miles of desert, and seen a pool the size of a sports arena in a place where rain almost never falls. But here's the question that has been waiting underneath all of this. If the Nabataeans were this resourceful, this good at bending the world to their will, then why did their city die? What happened to Petra? And what about the Treasury, that enormous facade where no one ever carved a single word? Before we get to the ending, there is one more story to tell. The story of how the Nabataeans went up against the most powerful military force in the ancient world and won. Twice. 312 BC, night. Somewhere in the desert, 36 kilometers from Petra, 4,000 Greek infantrymen and 600 cavalry are camped in the open, sleeping on the ground. They are professionals, soldiers trained in the Macedonian style, carrying the long sarissa spears that Alexander the Great made famous across half the world. Their commander is a general named Athenaeus, and he serves Antigonus One-Eye, one of the warlords who carved up Alexander's empire after his death. Antigonus sent Athenaeus south with a simple order: take whatever the barbarians have. And the operation went perfectly. Athenaeus had timed his raid for the annual market season, when the Nabataean men were away from Petra, trading in the desert. The city was nearly undefended. The Greeks marched in, took what they found, and marched out. In their baggage train, 14 tons of silver, bales of frankincense and myrrh, and captured women and children. The soldiers were exhausted and weighed down with plunder, but morale was high. The mission was done. Tomorrow they'd be heroes. They never saw tomorrow. Hours after the raid, the Nabataean men returned to the city and found what had happened. Survivors told them which direction the Greeks had gone. A pursuit began. 8,000 riders on camels, moving across open desert in the dark. In this kind of terrain, camels are far faster than horses. They cover ground more quietly, they don't need water as often, and their broad feet gripped loose sand where a horse would stumble. The Nabataeans caught the Greek column in the third watch of the night, the deepest hours before dawn. The soldiers were asleep. They had posted guards, presumably, but the weight of the loot and the fatigue of the march had done their work. The camp was still. What happened next was quick. The Nabataeans rode through the camp, and by dawn not one of the 4,000 Greek infantrymen was left alive. Only about 50 of the cavalry escaped, scattered into the dark on horseback. The Nabataeans recovered the silver, the frankincense, the women, and the children. And then they did something that says more about them than the battle itself. They sat down and wrote a letter, in Aramaic, their own language, addressed to Antigonus One-Eye, the most powerful warlord in the eastern Mediterranean. The letter explained, calmly and politely, why the Nabataeans had destroyed his army, and it asked for peace. 4,000 professional soldiers wiped out in a single night by camel-mounted fighters who had crossed 36 kilometers of open desert to catch them. The kind of one-sided outcome that military historians call asymmetric warfare, where a smaller, lighter force defeats a larger, heavier one by choosing when and where to fight. The Nabataeans fought on their own ground at the hour they chose, and then, instead of celebrating, they wrote a diplomatic note. Antigonus did not accept it gracefully. He was furious. He assembled a much larger force and sent it south under the command of his son, Demetrius. This time, the army numbered 4,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, twice the size of the first expedition. The mission was the same: punish the barbarians. But the Nabataeans had been watching. Sentries posted on the hilltops above the desert lit signal fires as soon as the Greek column appeared on the horizon. By the time Demetrius reached Nabataean territory, the people had already scattered. Livestock was hidden, valuables were buried, and the population retreated to a place they knew no army could take: the flat summit of al-Biara, that same rocky plateau with its 51 hidden cisterns and its single, narrow approach. The mountain we climbed earlier, the one that looks empty from the top until the scanners reveal what's underneath. Demetrius marched his army to the base of al-Biara and attacked. All day his soldiers tried to force their way up the narrow path to the summit. All day the Nabataeans held them off. The advantage of the terrain was absolute. One man standing at the top of a steep, narrow path can hold back a dozen below him. The Greeks gained nothing. The next morning, a voice called down from the wall above. Diodorus recorded the words, and they are worth hearing in full, because they tell you everything about how the Nabataeans thought.
King Demetrius, with what aim or under what compulsion are you making war against us, who live in the desert, in a land without water, without grain, without wine? We beg you, accept gifts and withdraw your army, and hereafter count the Nabataeans as friends, for you cannot remain here long, having no water. It's a remarkable speech. There is no anger in it, no threats, no boasting, just a calm observation about the facts. You have no water. We do. Stay as long as you like, but we both know how this ends. Demetrius took the gifts and left. His father, Antigonus, was livid. But there was nothing to be done. The Nabataeans couldn't be conquered by force because the desert itself fought on their side. Every hidden reservoir and camouflaged water store, every dry mile of sand between Petra and the outside world was part of their defense. The same strategy that kept them free from bandits kept them free from empires. 2.5 centuries passed, the world changed around them. Alexander's successor kingdoms rose and fell. Rome grew from a city-state into the largest empire the Mediterranean had ever seen. And Rome had a problem. It was addicted to frankincense. Thousands of temples burning incense day and night, and every grain of it passing through Nabataean hands taxed at 25%. Emperor Augustus decided to cut out the middlemen. In 26 BC, he dispatched an expeditionary force under Prefect Aelius Gallus to sail down the Arabian coast, find the frankincense-producing regions, and bring them under Roman control. The Nabataeans heard about the expedition, and they made a decision that, for sheer nerve, is hard to match in the ancient world. They didn't resist. Instead, with perfect courtesy, they offered Rome a guide, a man named Sylleus. Sylleus faced an impossible situation. If he helped the Romans reach the frankincense lands, Nabataean trade would collapse. Their wealth, their independence, everything they had built over centuries would be finished.
But if he refused outright, he would bring the fury of Rome down on his people. And Rome, at the height of its power, was not something any small kingdom could survive. So Sylleus chose a third path. He would guide the Romans as promised. He would simply guide them the wrong way. For 6 months, Sylleus led the Roman army through the worst terrain the Arabian Peninsula had to offer. Overland, through trackless desert where no caravan route existed. By sea, through shallows and reefs that tore at the hulls of Roman ships. The soldiers, trained for European warfare, had no experience with the desert. They ate plants that turned out to be poisonous. They drank from water sources that made them sick. Scurvy spread through the ranks, then dysentery. Men began to die, not in battle, but from exhaustion and disease. In 6 months, the Roman expedition covered a distance that Nabataean caravan traders normally crossed in a few weeks.
When Gallus finally understood that he had been deceived, that his guide had been leading him in circles through a wasteland, he turned the army around and headed home. The return trip, without Sylleus choosing the route, took 60 days. Strabo, the Roman geographer, wrote about the expedition afterward with undisguised bitterness. This campaign, he said, contributed little to our knowledge of those lands. Sylleus returned to Petra. He had spent half a year pretending to help an empire, while quietly destroying its army from the inside, without ever drawing a sword. His deception bought the Nabataeans more than a century of independence. Rome would not try again for a long time. But Rome doesn't forget, and empires, even patient ones, eventually get what they want. In 106 AD, more than 130 years after Sylleus made fools of the legions, the last Nabataean king died, and Rome came back. This time, there was no clever guide to lead them astray. This time, the ending was quiet, almost routine. And it began the long unraveling of everything the Nabataeans had built. The last Nabataean king was named Rabble II. He had a legitimate heir, a son named Obidas, who should have taken the throne after his father's death. But Emperor Trajan didn't need Nabataean heirs. In 106 AD, 2 Roman legions entered Nabataean territory, one from the north and one from the south. They met almost no resistance. The armies marched through the desert, reached the cities, and that was that. The kingdom was over. What's striking is how little anyone cared to write about it. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, a man who normally fills entire pages with the details of military campaigns, compresses the whole takeover into a single sentence. He writes that Palma, the governor of Syria, subdued the part of Arabia around Petra and made it subject to the Romans. That's all. One sentence for the end of a kingdom that had lasted centuries. And the coins that Rome minted to mark the occasion didn't even use the word capta, which means captured. They said adquisita, acquired, the way you'd describe buying a house. Nabatea wasn't conquered, it was absorbed. The Nabataeans, who had destroyed a Greek army in a single night and led Rome's legions in circles for 6 months, handed over their kingdom without a fight. Why? We don't know for certain. Perhaps the kingdom was already weakened. Perhaps Rabble made a deal before he died. The sources are silent, as the Nabataean sources always are. Rome, for its part, was practical. The new rulers left Petra's water system completely intact. It was too well engineered to replace. They built a highway, the Via Nova Traiana, stretching 400 kilometers from Petra south to the Red Sea. But they moved the regional capital north to a city called Bosra, closer to Damascus and the trade routes that mattered to Rome. Petra was no longer the center of anything. It was a stop on someone else's road. And then the trade itself began to shift. For centuries, goods from the east had traveled overland through the desert because there was no better option. But Roman-controlled Egyptian ports on the Red Sea coast now offered a cheaper alternative. You could load frankincense onto a ship in Yemen, sail it up the Red Sea, unload it in Egypt, and send it across the Mediterranean by sea. The desert route, the route that had made the Nabataeans wealthy, started losing traffic. The caravans still came, but fewer of them, carrying less. At the same time, the product at the heart of it all began to lose its market. Christianity was spreading through the Roman Empire, and the new faith wanted nothing to do with the rituals of the old one. Pagan temples burned frankincense by the ton. Christian churches, deliberately, did not. To the early Christians, incense was the smell of the gods they had rejected. Temples closed across the empire, and demand for frankincense fell sharply. Petra's share of a shrinking trade grew smaller year by year. You can see the decline in the archaeology. Lian Badal's pool, the one beside the Great Temple, the enormous basin with its island pavilion where people once gathered and looked out at the water, was found with a thick layer of animal bones on its floor. Someone had turned it into a dump. And this happened in the 2nd century AD, before the earthquake, before the worst of it. The pool wasn't destroyed by disaster. It was abandoned because nobody had a reason to maintain it anymore. And then the earthquake came. May the 18th, 363 AD, the middle of the night. The first tremors arrive in the 3rd hour. People wake, the shaking stops. Some go back to sleep. Then, in the 9th hour, the real shocks hit. The African and Arabian tectonic plates shift against each other along the fault line that runs through the Jordan Valley, and the energy released travels outward in waves. This is the Galilee earthquake, one of the most destructive in the recorded history of the region. Bishop Cyril of Jerusalem, writing in the aftermath, says that more than half of Petra has been destroyed. The Temple of the Winged Lions was damaged beyond repair, and the Great Temple cracked and collapsed. The theater broke apart. These buildings were never rebuilt. Nobody had the money or the reason to put them back together.
but the buildings could be lived without.
The water system could not, and the water system was wrecked. Underground pipes cracked along their joints. Dams that had stood for centuries split apart. The channels that had carried floodwater safely around the city, the same channels that Uli Belvald would one day restore, buckled and broke. And for the first time in hundreds of years, when the winter rains came, there was nothing to stop them. Floodwater that had been caught and stored and directed for generations now ripped straight through the center of Petra, down the main street, between the ruined buildings. Archaeologist Tom Paradise found empty sockets on that street where paving stones had once been set. The stones were gone, torn out of the ground by the force of the water. Paradise put it simply: the flooding may have been the end of Petra's golden age. And here is the thing that makes this story hurt. Water gave Petra life. Springs and pipes and dams, cisterns beneath the temples, hidden reservoirs out in the open desert, all of it had turned an impossible place into a thriving city.
And when the system broke, water became the thing that finished it off. Without the control system, every winter rain was a flood, and every summer was a drought. The very force that had made the city possible now made it unlivable. People didn't leave all at once. Some stayed among the ruins, building small shelters from the rubble, sleeping in the old caves the way the first Nabataeans had done centuries earlier. In the 5th century, another earthquake struck. After that, the larger houses were abandoned for good. In the 6th century, Petra still had Byzantine churches with mosaic floors, which tells you that some community held on. In the 7th century, there was still a bishop here, a man named Athenogenes. But sometime before 687, the office of bishop ceases to exist in the records. It simply stops being mentioned. Around this time, Arab armies swept through the region, carrying the new faith of Islam across the Middle East. They passed through the lands where Petra stood. They did not mention the city, not a word. It didn't interest them.
Whatever was left of Petra's population had either gone or blended into the surrounding Bedouin tribes. The carved facades were still there, enormous, still standing in the red stone. But nobody was looking at them. A city doesn't die from a single blow. Petra's end was a cascade, one thing after another, each one making the next one worse. The trade routes moved, and the core product lost its buyers. The administrative center shifted somewhere else, and when the earthquake shattered the infrastructure, nobody had enough reason to repair it. There was no single morning when the last person walked out of the gate and closed it behind them. The city just grew quieter, year by year, generation by generation, until there was no one left to remember what it had been. For the Muslim peoples who came after, the giant carved facades became part of a different story. They were understood as the dwellings of the people of Thamud, a civilization mentioned in the Quran, punished by God for their pride.
The Quran's Surah Al-Araf says that the earthquake seized them, and that morning found them lying prone in their dwellings. They had carved homes in the mountains, feeling secure. But the mighty blast overtook them, and all they had earned was of no use to them. Petra became a parable, a warning carved into a cliff, a reminder that stone, however beautifully shaped, doesn't last forever. And for 1,000 years, that parable was all that remained. Then, one August morning in 1812, a Swiss man, dressed as a Muslim pilgrim, walked into a narrow canyon, lied to his guide about wanting to sacrifice a goat,
and stepped out the other side into a place that the rest of the world had forgotten for a millennium. The circle closed. Back to the building where everything started. Al-Hasne, the Treasury, the facade with no inscription. We've been carrying this question since the beginning. Who built it, and why did they leave it unsigned? Here is what we now know, or what archaeologists believe they know. The building was almost certainly a mausoleum, a royal tomb, built for a Nabataean king. The most likely candidate is Aratus IV, who ruled from 9 BC to 40 AD, the decades when the Nabataean kingdom was at the height of its wealth and power. His title, found on coins and in tomb inscriptions across the kingdom, was lover of his people. No other Nabataean king used that phrase. It was his, and his alone. Look at the facade closely, and you begin to see something beyond beauty. The columns are Greek, Corinthian style. Between them stand statues of Castor and Pollux, the twin heroes of Greek mythology, known as the Dioscuri. Above, there is an image of the Egyptian goddess Isis, and alongside her, symbols of Dushara, the chief god of the Nabataeans. This isn't a Greek building, and it isn't an Egyptian one. It's a Nabataean building that borrows from every great civilization the Nabataeans had dealt with and says, calmly, in stone, "We belong in their company. We are the equals of Greece, of Egypt, of Rome. This city is the capital of the world." That much scholars have pieced together from style and context. But there's another discovery about the Treasury, a more recent one, and it changes the way you look at every carved facade in Petra. A geomorphologist named Tom Paradise spent 30 years studying how the Nabataeans carved their buildings. Near the Treasury, there are small, square cut marks in the rock face, rows of them running vertically up the cliff beside the facade. For a long time, people assumed these were scaffolding holes. It made sense. If you're carving a building 40 meters tall, you need something to stand on, and the obvious answer is scaffolding. Wooden beams set into holes in the rock with platforms built across them. The problem, Paradise realized, was wood. Petra is a desert. Trees are scarce. Building a scaffold tall enough and strong enough to carve the entire treasury would have required enormous quantities of timber. Where would it come from? And where did it go afterward? The answer came from a different building. Elsewhere in Petra, there is a structure known as the unfinished tomb. Its upper half is fully carved, columns and decoration complete. Its lower half is bare rock, untouched. If the Nabataeans had used scaffolding built from the ground up, the bottom would be finished first, and the top would be bare. But the opposite is true. The top was done. The bottom was still waiting. The Nabataeans carved from the top down. Here is how Paradise believes it worked. The builders started at the very top of the cliff. They drove metal pins into the stone and laid 2 wooden planks across them, making a narrow platform just wide enough to stand on. From this platform, they carved the uppermost section of the facade, the ornamental crown, the urn, the figures. When that section was finished, they pulled the pins, moved down, and set new ones a level lower. The stone debris from the carving fell to the ground below and gradually formed a ramp. As the builders descended, the ramp rose to meet them. By the time the lowest section of the facade was complete, the debris ramp reached nearly to the top. They cleared the ramp, and the building was revealed, finished, from top to bottom. No scaffolding, no forest of timber, 2 planks and a handful of pins. Paradise tested this. He brought professional stonemasons to a site in the American Southwest and had them replicate the technique on a small scale. It worked. The carving was precise. The platform held. He concluded that this method was physically viable at the scale of the Treasury. "We don't know of any other culture that used this engineering technique at this scale," he said. "And those square cut marks beside the Treasury?" Paradise looked at them again. Their pattern didn't match the top-down method. They were most likely left by treasure hunters, generations of Bedouin who climbed up the cliff face trying to reach the stone urn at the top, the one they believed held gold. The marks are the scars of greed, not the traces of the builders. The builders themselves left nothing behind. When the work was done, all evidence of how it was done vanished with the debris. Burckhardt, standing in front of this building in 1812, wrote in his journal, "Great must have been the wealth of a city which could afford to lavish such expense on the tombs of its dead." He was right. But he was seeing only the surface. Behind the facade, behind the beauty, there was something deeper. The Nabataeans understood open-channel hydraulics 20 centuries before the textbooks were written. They terraformed a desert into farmland by trapping soil 1 rainstorm at a time, and led the most powerful army in the world through 6 months of wasteland without ever drawing a sword. Their alphabet, without their knowing it, became the script of the Quran. What does Petra mean? Every era has answered that question differently. The Bedouin, who lived among the ruins, saw the pharaoh's treasure. Crusaders passing through in the 12th century saw a fortress, and the European romantics of the 19th century saw a lost world of exotic beauty. Steven Spielberg saw the Holy Grail. But what Petra actually is, when you strip away all the projections, is a monument to ingenuity. Proof that human beings can thrive in the most hostile conditions on Earth if they pay close enough attention to what the land is telling them. If they watch how water moves through rock and notice that a 4-degree angle keeps a pipe from bursting. If they understand that a desert, properly read, is not an obstacle, but a weapon and a home. The Nabataeans left us no books, no chronicles, no letters. Only stones and inscriptions on graves. And yet look how much we've managed to find out. An American engineer tilted a test tank in California and discovered that an ancient civilization got the physics right. An archaeologist from Ohio dug into a market and found a swimming pool. Laser scanners flew over the Jordanian desert and revealed 32,000 acres of farmland that nobody knew was there. A Swiss architect studied flood dams in a canyon and found he couldn't improve on them. A geomorphologist handed 2 planks to a stonemason and proved that you can carve a palace from the top of a cliff, working your way down, if you're patient enough and trust the stone. We are reconstructing the world of a people who vanished 1,500 years ago. And we're doing it the way they would have understood. Drop by drop, shard by shard, 1 chisel mark at a time. What else will we find if we keep looking? Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end. If this story stayed with you, if something surprised you or made you think, a like and a subscription would be the best way to support this channel. Every like helps the algorithm show this to someone else who'd enjoy it. Here's a question to close on. The Nabataeans left us no books, no chronicles, nothing but stones and tombs. And yet we've managed to reconstruct their world piece by piece. If you could send one question back in time to a Nabataean builder standing on those two planks at the top of the Treasury, what would you ask them? Leave your answer in the comments, and thank you for watching.